One of the best ways to become familiar with layers is to actually work with them and to really see how you can use layers to build groups of objects and all of that. And so that's exactly what we're going to do here. I'm going to switch from this current image that we have over to a photograph of mine that I took a while back, and zoom out a little bit so that you can see the whole thing. You notice that I took the picture with the heart off-centered, and that was just in case I wanted to add type here. And so I was very deliberate in that. So let's say that we want to make adjustments and to create a meme that we would share on Pinterest and Facebook and those kinds of things. And so we basically build from the ground up, okay? And our background, of course, is the photograph. And just for the sake of really creating something positive out of this, I'd like to start off by actually darkening this photo just a little bit. And we can do that by using levels. We've looked at levels before. Control L or Command L brings up levels. And if I move the midtone slider to the right just a little bit, it darkens that image. So don't need to darken it a lot. So I'm going to click OK. And so the next thing that I want to do is actually create a rounded edge box that'll go right here next to the heart. Okay, a rounded edge box. And the easiest way to do that is to use our rounded rectangular path tool, which we looked at in a previous video. And I'm going to select the fill color as white so that it immediately comes in as that color. We may change it later, but what I'm going to do is just left mouse click and start dragging so that I can create this box. And I want it to be, I'm kind of eyeballing it, but I want it to be somewhat equidistant. Now, I'm not really happy with the amount of curve on the edges, and so, we can edit that just by clicking and dragging. Remember, we did that earlier when we were looking at the paths. And so let's take it up to maybe 150 pixels. This is a big image, so we have plenty of pixels to work with. And I think that that'll work. That's acceptable. Okay, so I'm going to turn off the properties palette there. And yeah, I think everything will be fine here. Now that we have this paths layer, you notice that it automatically created a layer. I can do a number of things. I can change the opacity with it being solid white and reduce it down to, say, 50%. And so it kind of ghosts into the background. You can see a little bit of the background through, which is kind of nice. And so it's not like the type wouldn't stand out against the color, because it certainly would. But by creating a rounded edge box, it just kind of draws attention to the type a little bit more, which we're going to add in just a moment. So the next thing that we're going to do is I want to show you a couple other options that we have. Remember, in the previous video, whenever we right mouse click, one of our options was blending options. Okay, and I'm going to just select that, and you can see, let's move it out of the way here, that we have a number of choices. They call them layer styles or blending options. You can call them either one, and the different styles are listed here on the left. Some of them may seem familiar to you because they have counterparts in the Photoshop tools like gradient and stroke and all of that. But these are specifically applied to layers, and you have a lot of control over how they interact with objects on those layers. So for instance, let's say that I wanted to add a drop shadow just to accentuate this rounded box. I can very easily click drop shadow, turn it on, and whenever I click on that layer, you'll notice that the center section changes to controls just for the drop shadow. So I can control the size of it. I can control how far it is away from the box itself. I can control the opacity. Right now it's by default set at 75%. I can increase that. I can also change the angle. So right now the default is 30, so you notice that the shadow is kind of down and to the left. I can change this to say 90% if I want it to be straight down. Okay. I can also cause it to be anti-aliased, which means that it just smooths out a lot better when it's interacting with different colors. I could even control contours of how it appears. You notice that by selecting just the straight angle, it appears like a normal drop shadow. If I apply one of the other choices, it adds another level of dimensionality to it, which I almost never use those, but I just wanted to highlight those for you. And you can also control the color of the drop shadow simply by clicking on the color box, maybe sample a darker green from the image itself. You notice the eyedropper tool down here. Click OK, and so now the drop shadow has a slight green cast to it. And the blend mode here you can experiment with. Each one of these is going to give you a different result. Multiply takes the color and adds it to whatever it's underneath, okay, as opposed to screen, where it actually doesn't show up at all because it's subtractive. If you say go with hard light, it multiplies it into the background, and you can't really see it so much with the drop shadow, but I'll show you some other examples here in a little while. Hard light multiplies very similarly the way multiply does, but it also enhances the saturation, and multiply in and of itself does not do that. So normally for drop shadow you're going to want to stay with the default and just choose multiply. Another thing that we could do with this, of course, we have drop shadow, but we could also add an outer glow instead of drop shadow, which basically works very similar to drop shadow, but it evenly adds whatever shadow or light glow that you want to add. It adds it evenly around the entire object. You can also add overlays, gradient overlays to your object, just like what we saw in the past with gradients. You have the same level of control just like you did before, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time going in these. You can control the angle, whether it's linear, radial angle, reflected, or diamond, just like the regular gradient options. You have all of those same options here, just applied to whatever's on this specific layer. If you want to shift the color from the white that we're currently using, I can choose color overlay and then click and select any color that I choose, like the yellow for instance. And you notice that it's changed it. As soon as I uncheck it, it goes back to the default white. Satin just gives an interesting look to the object, kind of a dimensionality to it. You can kind of see there. So it just gives it a little bit of a three-dimensional kind of feel to it. Okay. Inner glow works the same as outer glow, except that the ghosting is on the inside instead of the outside. Like for instance, if we went with say 100% white and we left it on screen, and in this case we would choose choke to make it bigger. Actually, you're not really going to see it much because of it already being white. So let's take it a different direction. Let's go with green and change the blend mode from screen to multiply. Now you can see where it's actually going into the inside. So you can get some pretty interesting effects just by using the different glows in different ways. Okay, and you also have softer or precise. That just controls how it's interacting with the pixels around it. And of course you also have control over opacity. Inner shadow is the exact same thing as drop shadow, except that it's inside. And one of the cool features about inner shadow is that it can make your object look like it's sunk down into the previous layer. Like if I increase the size of this just a little bit and change up the distance a little bit, you can see where it actually looks like it's going down into the paper. Okay, so it's a very cool effect. Stroke, of course, just puts an outline around whatever object is on the layer. And bevel and emboss gives a 3D effect, so I can control the depth of it, and we can soften that up a little bit. We go chisel hard, which makes it much sharper looking. We can control shading and all that kind of stuff. So a lot of different options to experiment with. The ones that you'll likely use the most are drop shadow, outer glow, inner shadow, stroke, and in some cases color overlay or gradient overlay as well. So for now, I'm just going to click OK to apply the drop shadow. So you'll notice that it adds an extra layer of dimension to the box that I added. Okay. And you'll notice the slight outline you can see there. It's really created because we're working with a path. So if I click on the background layer, you notice that you can't see that anymore. Alright, now the next thing that we're going to do is I'm going to add some type, and we haven't really looked at the type tools yet. So I'm going to switch from the Essentials workspace to the Typography workspace, just so that we have access to our type tools. And you'll notice that our layers palette is still here. But I'm going to type in love believes all things, you know, from the Bible verse. And I think we're going to choose, I'm going to sample a dark green. We'll use that for the color right now. And you'll notice over here in the paths area, we have the type tool. So you'll want to click that, and then over on the right, you have the ability to choose your character. And depending on what fonts you have installed, you may have a lot of options or not. Okay. Great Vibes is a nice script. And so to create a type layer, you want to make sure that whenever you are adding type, whatever layer you currently have selected, which I just selected the rounded rectangle, whenever you click, it will add type to that layer. Above it, it'll actually create a new layer and it'll add type to it. And you want to make sure whenever you're typing on a rectangle that it's actually usually a smart idea. Let's just undo that. To click outside of the object initially and start typing, because if not, it's going to insert your type inside the path. I don't know if you noticed that earlier. Let's hit undo here. Okay, so you notice that when I have my type tool selected and I'm inside the path, notice that it's a circle. That means that the type is going to be applied inside this path. Outside, you notice that it's different. Okay, so I can actually draw a type box and type within there. Another option that I have is with the paths out of the equation, I can just click anywhere and start typing as well. And we'll just type in, actually let's just type in love never fails. And once you type your type in, if you double click that, you can double click it to select it, and then you'll notice that we can come up here and choose a larger size if there's not one Once 72 is the largest default size, we could type in a much larger one, like say 200, so that we can actually see the letters there. And then once we're happy with the size that we have, we can just click off and click to another layer. And of course, it's still below the rectangle. So if I left mouse click and drag, it will reorganize the layers. And then I can choose the move tool to move my type into place. Okay. All right, now let's say that we wanted to actually make the type even larger and just have like love on one line, never, and then fails. Okay, so here's what we're going to do to achieve that. I'm going to increase the size to say 400. Looks like we could even go a little bit bigger, say 500. And then I'm going to put never on another line, and then the same with fails. I'm going to put that on another line, and you notice that it's all bunched together, and there's a specific reason for that, and I'll show you why. If I double click these so that I have all of the type selected, you'll notice that where we have the 500, that's the size of the font, but over here on the right, this is the distance between the lines. Okay, so if I type 500 in there, then all of a sudden it spreads out. You'll see, and we actually might want to make it like 600. And then if I click on the move tool again, I can move this up into the space. And so now it looks more acceptable. Love never fails. Okay, now a couple things that I want to point out here. You'll notice that actually I must have accidentally removed our drop shadow. So let's just add that in again. And make that 90. And let's make it a little bit darker. Okay. So we have our rounded rectangle with the effect. We have the type. Now let's say that I wanted to, let's say that I was done with this and I wanted to group a couple of these things together. I can select these two layers, clicking on the bottom, hold the shift key down or the control key, whichever you prefer, and click so that they're both selected. And then whenever I right mouse click, you notice that I have a number of new options. I can duplicate the layers, I can delete them. I can convert to a smart object. I can link them together, rasterize the type. What that means is that if I rasterize the type, it will no longer be editable. Okay, and there are some cases where that makes sense to do if you need to do custom editing to the shape of the type rather than the font itself. You can also warp the text, and we'll look at that a little later on when we're focused more on just text. Okay, another option that we have, those are options just from right mouse clicking, but you'll notice up here in the right hand corner we also have this menu, and if I click on that, we get a completely different set of options. Some of them are the same, like convert to smart object and delete and duplicate layers, but you also notice that we have new group from layers. We have merge layers, merge visible, flatten image, and we'll talk about these in just a little bit. What we're interested in right now is making a new group from the layers. Okay, so I'm going to click that, and we can name the group, and we're going to name it love text. We can choose to color it if we want, just to assign the color for that group. Click OK. And so now you'll notice that instead of us having the two layers there, we just see one. And with this selected, if I choose the move tool, everything that's in this group is moved and affected simultaneously. Okay. Now, if I want to go back and edit a specific layer within this group, you'll notice if I hit the drop down arrow, there they are. So I can still go in and edit these individually. So you want to keep that in mind. Now, the other option that I want to point out is that working with groups like this is another great way of making your workspace very easy to manage, just by having multiple groups. Especially, here's a great for instance, if you're designing book covers and you're doing a lot of work for the front cover, then the spine, and the back cover, you can create groups of all the elements just for the front cover, all the elements just for the spine, all the elements just for the back cover. It's what I do all the time. And that way it makes it a lot easier to manage, because then you can also turn off the groups. So just focus on one specific area. It makes it a lot easier. Okay? So that's all we're going to cover in this video. In the next video, we're going to get into even more features that we have available to us in working with layers.